They thought it would be an easy heist, cattle grazing unattended on a remote ranch at the edge of Wilson County. A simple operation: ride in at dusk, round up the prime stock, and disappear into the mountain passes before anyone notices. Clayton "Viper" McGraw had been rustling cattle across 3 territories for years, and this isolated spread looked like the softest target he'd seen in months. What the Rustlers didn't know was that Maggie Thornton's Diamond T Ranch was anything but unprotected. As Viper crouched behind a ridge overlooking the property, studying the seemingly peaceful scene through his brass spyglass, he was being watched by eyes far sharper than his own. "Riders on the North Ridge, 5 of them, armed," Susie Collins whispered, her keen gaze never leaving the distant figures. At just 22, she could spot a sparrow from 500 yards and hit it too. Beside her, Maggie Thornton nodded slightly, her weathered face betraying no emotion. The widow had inherited the Diamond T 3 years ago when her husband Thomas was killed by rustlers much like these. They'd thought a woman would sell off the land and move east. They were wrong. What Viper saw through his spyglass was exactly what Maggie wanted him to see: a prosperous cattle operation with minimal security. A few hands visible near the barn, no guards patrolling the perimeter. Cattle grazing peacefully in the lush valley. Easy pickings. "This'll be like taking candy from a baby," Viper chuckled to his second-in-command, a brutal man known only as Rook. "We'll hit them at midnight. With this moon, we can drive 50 head through Serpent Pass before sunrise." As the rustlers retreated down the ridge to make their final preparations, they remained oblivious to the network of sentries posted throughout the valley. Maggie's people, not just ranch hands, but skilled fighters, trackers, and most importantly, shooters who could thread a needle at 300 paces. Back at the ranch house, Maggie gathered her inner circle. Hank, the Shadow. Miller, a former Army scout who could track a ghost across bare rock. Doc Carson, whose steady hands could perform surgery or squeeze a trigger with equal precision. Ruby Deadeye Hart, a woman whose past remained a mystery, but whose marksmanship was legendary. And Susie Collins, the youngest but perhaps the most naturally gifted of them all. "They'll come tonight," Maggie told them, spreading a hand-drawn map of the ranch across the oak table. "And when they do, we'll teach them what happens when you try to steal from the Diamond T." If you've ever faced someone who underestimated you just because of who you are, let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next when these rustlers discover they've made a terrible mistake. Maggie sat on the porch, rocking gently in her chair, a Winchester rifle resting casually across her lap. Her weathered hands, strong from years of ranch work, moved methodically across the barrel, oiling and checking the mechanism. Though her pose appeared relaxed, her blue eyes remained vigilant, scanning the horizon with the intensity of a hawk. Inside, Ruby Hart cleaned her custom Sharps rifle, the stock polished to a shine from years of use. The woman rarely spoke about her past, but the precision with which she handled her weapon told its own story. "You think they'll really come tonight?" asked Susie, settling beside Ruby at the table. Despite her youth, there was nothing childish about the way she meticulously arranged her ammunition. "Maggie says they will," Ruby replied simply. That was enough for her. Across the room, Doc Carson played a soft melody on his harmonica, the gentle tune at odds with the preparations for violence. His medical bag sat ready beside his gun belt. He'd likely need both before dawn. Hank entered the house silently, a talent he'd perfected as a scout during the war. Set the signals with the boys. Anyone who approaches within a mile will know. The quiet evening continued, the calm before the inevitable storm. The hands not privy to Maggie's inner circle bedded down early, unaware of what was coming. Only those trusted with the ranch's true defense remained alert, their casual demeanor masking their readiness. It was Susie who noticed first. Standing by the window, she froze mid-sentence, her sharp eyes catching what others might miss: a subtle shift in the cattle's behavior at the north pasture. "They're moving," she said quietly, cutting through Doc's harmonica tune. Too organized. Too quiet. Maggie was on her feet instantly. "Positions!" she commanded, her voice low but carrying the weight of absolute authority. No one questioned, no one hesitated. Each member of her team knew exactly where to go and what to do. As they moved silently through the darkness, the first distant sounds of cattle being herded reached their ears. The rustlers had arrived, their dark silhouettes just visible against the night sky as they began systematically cutting prime cattle from the herd. Viper led his men with practiced efficiency, gesturing silently as they separated 20, then 30 head from the main group. These weren't amateurs. They were organized, methodical, and completely unaware they were being observed from all sides. "Let them get comfortable," Maggie whispered to Hank as they crouched behind a low stone wall. "Let them think they've won." Across the pasture, Ruby and Susie had positioned themselves in the windmill tower, their rifles ready. Doc and two trusted hands circled behind the rustlers, closing off their escape route. The rustlers worked with quiet confidence, believing themselves unseen in the darkness. Viper even allowed himself a small smile. This was indeed going to be an easy night's work. Then came the distinctive sound that every outlaw dreaded, the metallic click of a rifle hammer being cocked, followed by Susie's warning shot splitting the night air with a crack like thunder. The battle for Diamond T had begun. The warning shot from Susie's rifle froze every rustler in their tracks. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. Cattle half-herded, men caught in the open, the echo of the gunshot still reverberating across the valley. "What the hell?" Viper hissed, instinctively dropping into a crouch. "I thought you said this place was defenseless!" Before anyone could answer, a second shot kicked up dirt just inches from his boot. This wasn't random fire. It was a message, precisely delivered. "Scatter!" Viper ordered, and his men broke in different directions, seeking cover that wasn't there. The open pasture that had seemed so perfect for their operation now became a killing field. From her position at the windmill, Susie tracked a rustler running toward the tree line. Inhaling slowly, she squeezed the trigger. The man dropped without a sound, clutching his shoulder. "You're getting soft," Ruby muttered beside her, her own rifle cracking as she took down another rustler trying to mount his horse. The bullet shattered his knee, sending him tumbling to the ground with a howl of pain. Hank had already circled behind 3 of the outlaws, using the darkness and terrain like old friends. As they backed toward what they thought was safety, he emerged from the shadows. "Evening, gentlemen," he drawled, his revolver held steady. "Might want to reconsider your evening plans." Meanwhile, Maggie moved like a specter through the confusion, directing the counterattack with hand signals and short commands. This wasn't her first defense of Diamond T, and every movement spoke of experience won through blood and determination. Doc, who'd positioned himself on a small rise with a clear view of the south escape route, adjusted his spectacles calmly. His rifle steady, he picked off 2 rustlers trying to reach Viper. One shot to a thigh, another to a shoulder. Painful, debilitating, but not lethal. Doc had taken an oath once, long ago, and held to it still. The cattle, startled by gunfire, began to stampede, adding to the chaos. But Maggie had anticipated this too. Ranch hands appeared with torches, guiding the herd into a prepared corral, removing the rustler's prize from the equation. "We're surrounded!" yelled Rook, blood seeping from a graze on his temple where Ruby's bullet had kissed him with death but chosen to spare him. Viper cursed, ducking behind a water trough as bullets splintered the wood around him. This wasn't the easy score he'd expected. These weren't typical ranch defenders firing wildly in the dark. Every shot was placed with purpose, herding the rustlers like cattle themselves. "Fall back!" Viper finally ordered, his confidence shattered. "Back to the ridge." But retreat wouldn't be so simple. Maggie's sharpshooters had turned the night into a gauntlet, and the price of theft at Diamond T was being extracted 1 bullet at a time. The rustlers retreated in disarray, half their number wounded, the rest shaken to their core. What should have been an easy theft had become a nightmare of precision gunfire coming from all directions. They regrouped behind a rocky outcropping half a mile from the ranch, breathing hard and checking their wounds. "What kind of rancher has shooters like that?" gasped one man, binding a cloth around his bleeding arm. Viper paced furiously, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. "Someone tipped them off. Had to be." "A woman," Viper spat on the ground. "A damn woman made fools of us." "Not just any woman," another rustler interjected. "That's Maggie Thornton. Heard tell she was recruiting, bringing in shooters, trackers, building herself an army." "They're watching us still," Hank reported, returning to Maggie's side after tracking the rustlers' retreat, licking their wounds behind the east ridge. Maggie nodded, her expression unchanged despite their successful defense. "They'll be back. Viper's pride won't let him walk away." Doc was tending to Hank's arm where a bullet had grazed him, the wound minor but needing attention. "Hold still," he muttered, cleaning the injury with practiced efficiency. Lucky shot from their side. "We should hit them now," Ruby suggested, reloading her rifle methodically. "Finish this while they're scattered." Maggie shook her head. "Number, let them stew. Let fear and uncertainty do our work for us." She surveyed her people. "Besides, I want them to see exactly who they're up against, in daylight." The remaining rustlers exchanged uneasy glances. What had started as a simple cattle theft had escalated into something far more dangerous. "We need more men," Rook suggested. "No time," Viper snapped. "By dawn, they could have the whole county here. We end this tonight." He began outlining his desperate plan, assigning men to different approaches, splitting their already diminished forces further. As the rustlers prepared for their second assault, the moon slipped behind clouds, casting the valley into deeper shadow. The Diamond T's defenders used the darkness to further strengthen their positions, each one prepared for what was coming. The night was far from over, and Viper's desperation would only make him more dangerous. Viper himself led the charge toward the main house, 6 men at his back. "Burn it all!" he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "Let's see how her sharpshooters fare when they're flushing out like rats." "Next one goes through your skull!" she called out. The rustler dropped his torch and dove for cover. But another had made it to the barn's edge, tossing his burning brand onto the hay-covered floor. Flames leapt up instantly, hungry for the dry fodder. "Fire!" The alarm spread through Diamond T's defenders. Inside the barn, horses whinnied in panic, sensing the danger. Susie didn't hesitate. Abandoning her position, she sprinted toward the burning building. "Cover me!" she shouted, and instantly Doc and Ruby shifted their fire to protect her approach. Viper saw the opportunity in the chaos, leading his men in a rush toward the main house where he believed Maggie was coordinating the defense. "We get the woman! We end this!" he growled. What he didn't know was that Maggie had anticipated this very move. As Viper's group reached the house, the porch suddenly erupted with gunfire. Maggie herself rose from behind an overturned wagon, her Winchester in hand, while 2 ranch hands emerged from hidden positions beneath the steps. "Welcome to Diamond T," Maggie said calmly, before squeezing her trigger. Viper barely escaped the shot, diving behind a water barrel as 2 of his men fell, clutching wounds. Meanwhile, Susie had reached the barn, pulling her bandana over her face against the thickening smoke. Inside, horses kicked frantically in their stalls. With quick movements, she flung the stall doors open, slapping the terrified animals toward the exit. As she reached the last stall, a burning beam crashed down, blocking her path to freedom. Outside, Hank had engaged Rook and 3 rustlers trying to circle behind the house. Outnumbered but not outmatched, the former scout used the terrain to his advantage, appearing and disappearing like a ghost, each appearance punctuated by another rustler going down. The night was filled with gunfire, shouts, and the ominous crackling of flames as the battle for Diamond T reached its fevered peak. Viper's men, finding themselves outmaneuvered at every turn, began to fall back once more, their attack blunted by the precise defense. And still, the night wasn't over. The barn blazed against the night sky, casting flickering shadows across the battlefield that Diamond T Ranch had become. Trapped inside, Susie covered her mouth against the smoke, searching desperately for an escape route. The burning beam that blocked her path had transformed the barn into a death trap. Outside, Ruby spotted Susie's predicament through the barn's window. Without hesitation, she abandoned her position and raced toward the building, Doc providing covering fire as rustlers tried to take advantage of her exposure. "Hold on, Susie!" Ruby shouted, circling to the back of the barn where the flames hadn't yet reached. With the strength born from desperation, she smashed a rear window with her rifle butt, clearing the jagged glass with her sleeve. Susie heard the breaking glass and turned toward the sound, hope flashing across her smoke-smudged face. She scrambled toward the window, diving through the narrow opening just as another beam crashed down where she'd been standing seconds before. "Cutting it close," Ruby remarked, helping the younger woman to her feet. "Just keeping things interesting," Susie coughed, retrieving her dropped rifle. At the main house, Maggie watched the barn burn with stoic resolve. The building could be replaced, her people couldn't. Seeing that Ruby and Susie were safe, she made a swift decision. "Time to end this," she declared to Hank, who had rejoined her after driving off the rustlers at the rear flank. "No more waiting for them to come to us." Hank's weathered face broke into a predatory smile. "Been waiting to hear those words?" Maggie gathered her core team quickly, outlining her plan. The rustlers had retreated to regroup after their failed assault, believing they'd bought themselves breathing room. They were wrong. "Doc, Ruby, you provide cover from the ridge. Susie, circle east with Hank and flank their position. I'll come straight at them with the boys. Pin them between us." Everyone nodded, understanding their roles without question. Years of working together had forged them into a seamless unit. As the defenders of Diamond T moved out, Viper and his remaining men huddled behind the eastern ridge. Their numbers diminished, morale shattered. "This is madness," one of the rustlers hissed. "They're not just ranchers, they're killers." "Shut your mouth," Viper snarled, though doubt had begun to creep into his own mind. What had started as a simple cattle rustling operation had become a war he was losing badly. Rook suddenly stiffened, his hand going to his pistol. "You hear that?" The others fell silent, straining to listen. Nothing but the distant crackle of the burning barn. "I don't," one began, but never finished his sentence as Doc's rifle cracked from the darkness, the bullet taking him in the shoulder. Chaos erupted as shots rained down from multiple directions. The rustlers scrambled for cover, but there was none to be found. They'd been outflanked, caught in a deadly crossfire. Viper realized with growing horror that he'd completely underestimated his opponent. This wasn't just a defensive action. This was a coordinated military operation conducted by professionals. "Retreat!" he finally ordered, but it was too late. The counteroffensive had sealed their fate, and Diamond T was about to exact its price. Dawn broke over Diamond T Ranch, revealing the night's carnage in harsh light. The smoldering ruins of the barn sent wisps of smoke into the morning air, while Maggie's people tended to the wounded, both their own and the rustlers they'd captured. Viper had escaped with just 3 of his original crew, fleeing through a narrow ravine that even Hank's tracking skills couldn't safely follow in the darkness. Now, miles away in an abandoned mining shack, the rustler leader nursed his wounds and his rage. "I want her dead," he growled, pressing a dirty bandage against the bullet graze on his side. "Not just beaten, destroyed." Rook sat silently in the corner, his usual bravado replaced by a haunted look. "That wasn't natural, boss. The way they moved, how they shot. It's like they knew every move before we made it." The third man, a wiry rustler called Twitchy, nervously cleaned his pistol. "I heard stories in the saloon last month. Some drummer talking about the widow Thornton. Said after her husband got killed, she spent a fortune bringing in specialists. Former soldiers, scouts, even a female trick shooter from some traveling show." "A whole damn army," muttered the fourth, a hulking man named Blackwood, as he tied a crude splint to his broken finger. "Just to protect some cattle." Viper's eyes narrowed. "Not just cattle. It's about power, respect." He spat blood onto the floor. "No woman makes a fool of Clayton McGraw and lives to brag about it." Back at Diamond T, Doc Carson finished binding a ranch hand's arm where a bullet had grazed him. Nearby, Maggie surveyed the damage with Hank. "Barn's a total loss," Hank reported, "but we saved the horses and the cattle are accounted for." Maggie nodded, her expression betraying no emotion, though the barn had been one of the first structures she and Thomas had built together. Buildings can be replaced. "Viper got away," Ruby added, approaching from the makeshift holding pen where they'd secured the captured rustlers, with 3 others. "He'll be back," Maggie stated, not a question but a certainty, "and with more men next time." Susie joined them, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes bright with the adrenaline of survival. "Let him come. We'll be ready." Maggie studied her young protege with pride mixed with concern. "Don't get cocky. We got lucky." In town, 30 miles away, rumors were already spreading. The telegraph operator, a cousin to one of Diamond T's hands, sent messages to neighboring communities warning of rustlers and praising the ranch's successful defense. Word reached Viper as he and his remaining men cautiously entered the border town of Diablo Springs, a lawless haven for those running from justice. "I hear you're looking for men with special talents," Rollins drawled, sliding into the chair across from Viper. Viper's smile was cold as winter. "I'm looking for men who can help me destroy Maggie Thornton and everyone loyal to her." Rollins took a slow sip of whiskey. "The Diamond Tea woman? Heard she's got herself quite the operation. Won't come cheap." And so, as Maggie's people rebuilt their defenses, a new and deadlier threat was forming, one that would test the very limits of the widow's leadership and her sharpshooter's skills. Maggie knew Viper wouldn't accept defeat. Standing on her porch at daybreak 3 days after the attack, she watched riders approaching from the south. Not rustlers this time, but neighbors. "Word travels fast," Hank observed beside her, rifle resting casually across his arm. "Too fast," Maggie replied. "Either we've become local heroes, or they're here to tell us our trouble is now theirs." The riders, 5 men and 2 women representing nearby ranches, dismounted in the yard. Their leader, a grizzled rancher named Ellis Parker, removed his hat as he approached. "Mrs. Thornton," he began, his tone respectful but urgent. "Heard you had some unwelcome visitors." Maggie nodded, gesturing for the group to follow her inside. Once seated around her dining table, Ellis got straight to the point. Susie, who had been pouring coffee for the visitors, nearly dropped the pot. "The whole valley? That's 8 ranches, 3 homesteads, and the trading post." "Ambitious," Ruby remarked dryly from her position by the window, where she kept watch out of habit. Ellis continued, "He's telling anyone who'll listen that you've got gold hidden somewhere on your property. Says that's why you can afford such protection." Maggie's laugh was sharp. "The only gold here is my cattle and my people." A murmur of agreement rippled through the visitors. Each had their own stories of intimidation, stolen cattle, threats. None had Maggie's resources or training, but all had the same stake in the valley's future. "What exactly are you proposing?" Maggie asked, though she already knew the answer. "An alliance," Ellis stated simply. "Your knowledge, our numbers. We make it clear that attacking any one of us means dealing with all of us." Doc Carson, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Most of these folks have never fired anything beyond a hunting rifle, Maggie. They're not fighters." "Neither was I when I started," Maggie replied, her eyes traveling around the table. She saw fear in some faces, determination in others, but in all of them she recognized the same resolve that had driven her after Thomas's death. "But I learned, and so can they." By midday, the Diamond T had transformed into a training ground. Ranchers and farmers who had spent their lives building rather than destroying now learned the art of defense from Maggie's sharpshooters. Ruby worked with the women, impressed by their natural steadiness. "Don't pull the trigger," she instructed Martha, who was struggling with Ruby's heavy sharps rifle. "Squeeze it, like you're coaxing a secret from someone." Elsewhere, Hank taught tracking and ambush tactics, while Doc showed others how to treat wounds under fire. Susie, still sporting bandages from the barn fire, demonstrated how to make every bullet count. Maggie moved among them, offering corrections, encouragement, and most importantly, confidence. By evening, when the neighbors departed to prepare their own properties, something had changed. The isolated ranches of the valley had become something more, a community ready to defend itself. As night fell, Maggie gathered her core team. "It won't be enough," she admitted. "Not against professional gunmen." Maggie nodded, her mind already planning their next move. "Then let's make sure we're ready." The attack came at first light, 5 days after the initial raid. Viper had been busy. Nearly 30 riders poured over the ridge, no longer trying to hide their approach. At their head rode Viper and the dead-eyed gunslinger Rawlins, their faces set with cold determination. Maggie's warning system worked perfectly. Signal fires blazed across the valley, alerting all the Allied ranches. Within moments, Diamond T was ready, its defenders in position, its strategies set. The Rustlers' approach was different this time. No stealth, no subtlety, just overwhelming force. They split into 3 groups as they neared, aiming to hit the ranch from multiple angles. "Just like we planned," Susie remarked from her position in the hayloft of the newly constructed barn. Below her, Martha Wilcox and 2 other ranchers clutched their rifles, nervous but determined. The first shots came from Rawlins himself, his rifle barking from an impossible distance, the bullet splintering wood inches from Ruby's head in the windmill tower. "Found their sharpshooter," Ruby muttered, ducking down. To her spotter, Ellis Parker, she said, "When I move, count 3 seconds, then raise that hat on your rifle." When Ellis cautiously lifted the hat, another shot rang out, punching through it cleanly. Ruby, having shifted to a new position, now had Rawlins' location. She drew a slow breath, steadied her sharps, and squeezed the trigger. 800 yards away, Rawlins cursed as the bullet kicked up dirt beside his cheek, close enough to feel its passage. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. The main force of Rustlers hit the ranch's outer defenses with a roar of gunfire. They expected to overwhelm the defenders quickly, but instead found themselves channeled into prepared killing zones. The Valley ranchers, though inexperienced, had positioned themselves perfectly under Hank's guidance, creating overlapping fields of fire. "They're being slaughtered!" Rook shouted to Viper as 3 more Rustlers fell to the coordinated defense. Viper's face contorted with rage. "Push through! The house is our target!" Meanwhile, Doc Carson and a group of defenders were engaged in a fierce firefight near the corral. A Rustler's bullet caught one of the neighboring ranchers in the arm, and Doc smoothly transitioned from shooter to healer, binding the wound even as he continued directing their defense. At the main house, Maggie watched the battle unfold. The Rustlers were taking heavy casualties but still advancing. Their superior numbers were beginning to tell. "Susie," she called through a speaking tube that connected to the barn, "execute Thunderbolt." In the hayloft, Susie grinned. "You heard her, folks. Thunderbolt." Martha and the others pulled back a tarp, revealing 3 sticks of dynamite already fused. Using practiced motions, they lit the fuses, waited until they burned to the right length, and hurled them into the advancing Rustlers' path. The explosions tore through the attackers' ranks, sending men and horses flying in confusion. In that moment of chaos, Diamond T's defenders pressed their advantage, pouring fire into the disorganized Rustlers. Through the smoke and confusion, Viper spotted Maggie directing the defense from the house porch. With a snarl of hatred, he spurred his horse forward, bent on reaching his nemesis at any cost. "Maggie!" Hank shouted in warning, but was pinned down by gunfire from Rook and couldn't intercept. Viper crashed through the defensive line, his horse leaping the porch railing in a desperate charge. Maggie turned just in time, diving aside as horse and rider smashed through the front door of her home. The final confrontation was at hand. "Nowhere left to run, woman!" Viper snarled, firing twice into the table, wood splinters flying dangerously close to Maggie's face. "Who's running?" Maggie replied calmly, grabbing a cast-iron skillet from the floor and hurling it with deadly accuracy. The heavy pan caught Viper's gun hand, sending his pistol skittering across the floor. Cursing in pain, Viper lunged forward, tackling Maggie before she could reach her rifle. They crashed into the china cabinet, glass shattering around them as they grappled. Viper might have been wounded, but his rage gave him strength. His hands found Maggie's throat, squeezing with murderous intent. "I'll burn everything you've built to the ground," he hissed, his face inches from hers. Maggie's vision began to darken at the edges, but she didn't panic. Instead, her hand moved deliberately to her boot, drawing the small knife she always kept there. With a swift, practiced motion, she drove it into Viper's side. He howled, releasing her throat and staggering backwards. Maggie gasped for air, using the moment to scramble toward her Winchester. Viper, bleeding but far from finished, grabbed a broken chair leg and swung it viciously. "You should have just taken the cattle," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "This stopped being about cattle the moment you made a fool of me," Viper growled, circling her warily. Outside, the sounds of battle were changing. The Rustlers, leaderless and facing unexpected resistance, had begun to retreat. Inside, a different kind of war raged, intimate, personal, and deadly. Viper lunged again, but this time Maggie was ready. Sidestepping with the grace of a dancer, she brought the iron poker down on his outstretched arm with a sickening crack. Viper screamed as bones shattered, dropping to his knees. "Yield!" Maggie demanded, standing over him with the poker raised. Viper looked up, his eyes filled with hatred and something else, fear. For the first time, he truly saw the woman who had defeated him. Not just a widow defending her ranch, but a force of nature that had destroyed everything he'd built. "It's over," Maggie said simply. And it was. The battle for Diamond T Ranch ended not with a triumphant cheer, but with an exhausted silence that settled over the property like dust after a storm. Maggie stood on her porch, watching as the last of the Rustlers were rounded up and bound. Her right arm hung awkwardly, dislocated during her struggle with Viper, and blood from a dozen small cuts stained her shirt. But she remained standing, her presence a reassurance to all who fought beside her. Viper sat slumped against the porch railing, his broken arm crudely splinted, his face a mask of defeat. The once feared Rustler leader looked smaller somehow, his arrogance shattered along with his body. Hank approached, limping slightly but grinning through a blood-streaked beard. Final count, 11 Rustlers dead, 14 captured, the rest scattered to the wind. "And our side?" Maggie asked, her voice revealing the concern her face wouldn't show. 3 wounded, including Doc, but he's still patching up the others even with a bullet in his leg. Hank shook his head in admiration. "Stubborn old coot. No fatalities on our side? We got lucky." Susie emerged from the barn, supporting Martha Wilcox, who had taken a bullet graze to her thigh. "The neighbors fought well," Susie reported. "Better than anyone expected." Ellis Parker approached, leading his horse loaded with supplies. "More folks coming from town. They heard the shooting. Sheriffs finally decided to show up too, bringing a wagon for the prisoners." Maggie nodded, surveying the ranch. The newly built barn had suffered minor damage. Fences were shattered, and the main house would need significant repairs. But Diamond T still stood. More importantly, the community that had formed around it remained unbroken. "What happens now?" Martha asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Maggie turned toward Viper, her gaze unflinching. "Now justice happens. These men face a judge, not a lynch mob. We're not them." "Rebuilding starts tomorrow," Maggie announced to her weary defenders. "Today, we tend our wounded, bury their dead, and remember what we accomplished." As the prisoners were loaded into wagons, Viper glared at Maggie one last time. "This isn't over," he hissed. Maggie didn't bother responding. They both knew it was. 3 months after the battle, Diamond T Ranch had transformed. The scars of conflict were still visible. Bullet holes patched in the main house, the new barn still smelling of fresh-cut pine. But they stood as reminders of victory rather than wounds. The morning sun found Maggie on horseback, surveying her expanded herd. The neighboring ranchers had pooled resources, sharing cattle and grazing rights in an arrangement that benefited everyone. What Viper had tried to destroy through violence had instead grown stronger through unity. "Quite a sight," Hank remarked, riding up beside her. His limp was barely noticeable now. Maggie nodded, satisfaction evident in her usually guarded expression. "Never thought I'd see the day when 8 stubborn ranchers agreed on anything, let alone a shared grazing association." News had spread far beyond the valley. Viper and his captured men had been sentenced to lengthy terms in territorial prison. More significantly, the story of Diamond T's stand against overwhelming odds had become something of a legend. Young women from neighboring territories had begun arriving, seeking Maggie out. "They want to learn what you know," Susie explained one evening. "How to defend themselves, how to shoot, how to lead." At 22, she had become Maggie's right hand, commanding nearly as much respect as the widow herself. Today, Maggie was officially promoting Susie to lead the Sharpshooters training. As they gathered in the yard, Maggie kept her speech characteristically brief. "Strength isn't just in your arm when you fire a rifle," she told the assembled group, new recruits standing alongside her battle-tested veterans. "It's in knowing why you're fighting and who you're protecting." She placed her hand on Susie's shoulder. "This woman knows both. Follow her lead." As Maggie stepped back, watching Susie take command with natural confidence, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Hope for a future beyond mere survival. 5 years later, Diamond T Ranch had become more than just a cattle operation. It was an institution. Women from across the West made pilgrimages to train with Maggie's Sharpshooters, as they'd come to be known. The valley thrived under the protective watch of the skilled defenders who called it home. Maggie, her hair now streaked with silver, stood on her porch watching Susie drill a new group of recruits. Their precision had become legendary, so much so that cattle rustling in the entire territory had plummeted to nearly nothing. "Word came from the prison," Ruby said, joining Maggie with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Viper died last week. Lung fever." Maggie accepted the cup without comment. The man who had once threatened everything she built was now just another faded memory. "Think we'll ever face anything like that again?" Ruby asked. Maggie sipped her coffee, considering. "Someone will always want what we have. The difference is, now they know the price." In the training yard, Susie's voice rang out clear and confident as she instructed a young woman on proper rifle stance. The future of Diamond T was secure, not in its cattle or its land, but in the legacy Maggie had built. "To the women who defended Diamond T," Ruby said, raising her cup in toast. Maggie smiled, touching her cup to Ruby's, "and to those who'll carry it forward." If you enjoyed this incredible tale of courage and defiance, you won't want to miss our next video. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a single story.